The quickest object to create, sphere. Whatever your program says, create polygon primitives sphere, or just click on this icon in the polygon modeling shelf. That's done. The next simplest one, I'm going to show you a different technique. And so sure, I'm going to show you, besides different techniques of painting within Substance on these 5 objects, I'm also going to show you different modeling techniques. So one, use primitive objects whenever possible. Second, here's a cool shortcut. You can use SVGs created in Illustrator to create the silhouettes for your objects. So you can think about this as a way to go plan out your 3D objects in a 2D way based upon some reference material. And the reference material I'm using are just some photos I collected from online from some research. So jumping to Illustrator, you can use that photo research to make a flipper. And this was created so simply. Just drag out a rectangle. These circles on the inside the rectangle represent the curvature of the object in that corner. You can move in using the direct select tool. Those 2 vertices right there. And now I'm going to click and just drag all these corners at once. Since this corner is totally round and you still want the other end to be rounder, just shift click on both of those circles and drag them to complete the circle right here. Once you finish that shape, just turn off the stroke. This way you don't get a double line when importing it into your 3D modeling application. Export this as SVG. All that means in Illustrator, do File, Save As, making sure to select SVG down here. I'll just overwrite my original file. Click OK. You're done with Illustrator. To get that SVG in here, the polygon modeling shelf exposed, or you can go under Create SVG. Leads you to the creation of this SVG. And this is a placeholder SVG. Want to replace this one with the one that you just created. Click on Import. Select the SVG. Click Open, and there's the SVG. Now, it's not the generic grayscale color because you have to toggle off the display color, because right now it's using the colors from Illustrator. So going to Mesh Display, it's using the color from Illustrator to color the vertices. And go under Mesh Display, Toggle Display Colors attribute, and there's our normal grayscale object. So the flipper is pretty much done. I'll add a little details to it. Go ahead and hold down the J key and rotate it so it's 90 degrees flat on the floor. Press the D key to move that pivot all the way to the center. And let me D key again. Let me drag this flipper over here. And if it's not totally aligned with the floor, you go under your attributes, rotate along the negative X axis, set that down to negative 90. And I don't know why it's 2 degrees off, but I'll make that 0. So now it's perfect. Going under the SVG and scrolling to the mesh settings, curve resolution, increase that to make it look a lot more smooth. Now, if 10 isn't enough, because at 1, it's very faceted, 10 is rounder. If you still want it to be a little more round than this, you could type in a higher number. That's a little Mayaism. Most of these inputs, you could increase the number. Sometimes you can't, so trial and error, you'll find out. If the extrusion's a little too thick, go under the extrusion distance, and you could just pull down the slider like this. I'm going to be reusing this object. Right now I'm done with all these attributes, so edit delete by type history, or clicking this icon just to break the construction history. Just shift dragging to clone this. You could do also copy and paste to clone that as well. This will be the little rubber band that goes around the flipper. So the flipper, I'm going to, even though I have my research and there's no extra bevel on top, I'm going to add a bevel on top. So right click, face mode, selecting the top face, shift drag upward, and then do a scale like this to create that little extra dimension on top to catch the light. You can tweak your scale a little bit. So this is pretty much done. Next, I'm going to drag this shape down and scale it out a little bit to go around the flipper. It's there to protect the plastic flipper from cracking when that metal ball hits it. So flipper's done. Select these objects, stack them over here as you complete them. Next one, let's do the pin. Pin's pretty simple. All that is a cylinder. Going under the cylinder attributes, knocking the cap segments down from a high number down to 0, increasing the roundness of the cylinder. It's faceted as you zoom in. It might not matter, the pin's so small. Just in case, increase the subdivisions along the axis to 30 or 40. Let's try 40. From here, you could scale the pin smaller and then increase its size. To get this little extra cap, and this will be a demonstration of using multiple textures on the same object and using material IDs as a mask. So this way you can break apart your bigger objects and paint on them separately. Imagine you had a spaceship and you don't want to paint across the whole spaceship, you want to just focus in on a door. This will be the technique to do that by assigning multiple materials to the same object. To create that cap, selecting the top face, hold down the shift key to extrude. Scale it out. Move tool, which is the W key, extrude upward again. And let me taper that. To create an extra little ridge underneath it, just to make this a little more difficult. Pick up the multi-cut tool, which is under your modeling toolkit. Go to multi-cut, hold down the control key, and just click out like this. And that, by holding down the control key and clicking, it creates a cut right across the surface. So it's inserting an edge loop. Then right click, select all the top vertices, push them down like this, and scale up the top ever so slightly. And that creates a ridge. Let me move this whole thing upward. So I'm just looking for this small ridge line to be created. Now if you want to line these vertices up so they're completely horizontally snapped, just select that ring of vertices. And Maya has this cool way of dealing with scaling, where if I start scaling it upward, sure, they'll separate, but if you scale it downward, this hard limit, when all the vertices meet the horizontal to vertical connection, they just stop. So this will create a flat ridge going around. So one last object. The last shape is this little chiclet shape. Start out with polygon box. So each one of these techniques is a different way to go model things, just like each one of these objects will be painted differently in Substance 3D. And we'll learn a lot about Substance 3D, and you just learned a lot about modeling. Good review for the basics that you already know. So I'm just fidgeting with getting the scale kind of right. I'm going to use the bevel tool, so holding down, selecting this face, right click face, shift double click to select all those faces going around. If you don't know shift double click or it's not working, just shift and click around. I currently have object symmetry on. I'll turn it off for a moment. With the modeling toolkit selected, bevel, and that's all you have to do. Now you got this beveled surface. To make it look a little more rounder, now I'm going to turn on symmetry across the x-axis. Pick up the multi-cut tool, hold down the control key, and at the extremes of the edges, creating this ridge line here. Same thing up here and down here as well, because that will be useful later on. Trying to keep this object symmetrical. Selecting this top face and just lifting up a little bit more, creating that roundness to this. To make it look rounder, much like this one, apply a mesh smooth on the object level. So to the whole object, apply mesh smooth. And that's pretty much the shape we're looking for. The way I rounded out these edges, that's just the usual, selecting some vertices, and the symmetry is still on. pick up the Move tool, which is the W key. Press the B key and don't let go for the fall off. So B key and drag left and right with the left mouse button to increase and decrease the fall off. So you can nudge up and a little closer some of these vertices, and I'll do the same for the center ones. Just lift them up a little bit, and maybe the fall off is too tiny, so I'll increase it because you want this to be rounder. So you want a little influence going around there. So have some fun, adjust your target as you need. And there's our target. Let me drag it over to the area of finished objects. And the pin. 2 more steps, and both these steps are very quick. UVs. What's a UV? It's a coordinate system to describe how to texture map an object. You created a cylinder and extruded out the face to create this more interesting surface of the pin. If you go into the UV editor, UV editor, and select your object, it still looks like a cylinder. That's because all that extra extrusion is being hidden, being overlapped in the UVs. To fix this, it's going to be so easy, and we're going to use the same trick on all these objects. So select your object, go under UV, automatic. And that will unwrap the UVs. Think of it as unfolding, unraveling UVs. It will be more accurate to paint on. Less stretches will go on, less surprises as you paint. So the next task is just to select each object, select UV, automatic again. Nice and neat surfaces. All right, one last step. And that step is applying materials. The materials are used to identify the different parts as a whole or multiple parts. Parts as a whole, like these are 2 separate parts. We want to be able to identify them separately. And this object, we want to import, and it's one part, and have multiple regions to paint on. The top of the pin and the bottom of the pin. I'm just moving my viewport around so the menu doesn't fall off the screen. Right click, assign new material, blend. You can give it a name because that name would be used in Substance Painter to identify the object, and call this one pinball. Next object, the flipper. Select the inner flipper, not the little rubber around it. Right click, assign new material, blend, flipper. Right click, assign new material, blend, and I'll call this flipper bumper. And since that name didn't exist in the scene, it gets to keep it. I'll even give it an extra little color here so it's easy to identify in the scene as a separate part. This is the target. Right click, assign new material, blend, calling this one target, and give it a color. And also coloring them helps remind you what you already finished. Selecting all these faces, so right click face, just selecting the bottom shaft. I left the top unselected. Right click, assign new material, blend, and I'll call it pin shaft. Give it a color. And this could be the pin top. Selecting all these faces, and don't forget that little extra ridge underneath it. So hold down the shift key, shift double click going around. Right click, assign new material, blend, give it a color, and it will be pin top. So now export each object, selecting the object, file, export, selection. Export selection, file, export selection. So this is easy. File, export selection. Give them good names that you'll remember. When you're importing them later on. These two I'll export together. The flipper and that little rubber band around the flipper. File, export selection. Now that you have all these objects exported, the next part is going to Substance 3D Painter, importing each object, learning a different technique for painting, having a lot of fun along the way, making some cool, realistic looking materials, learning about how to do stencils and decals, how to use layers, and so much more.